Welcome to the Editor's Podcast. This is Linda Snetselaar, and I am Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and professor at the University of Iowa in the College of Public Health. And today we are going to be discussing the topic of GMOs. The title of this particular podcast is What We Know About GMOs, Current Research and Trends. I'm happy to have with me today Dr. Ruth MacDonald. She is professor and chair of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. She is also the assistant dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And her title today is What We Know About GMOs, Current Research and Trends. My first question, Ruth, is what are GMOs?
Linda, it's great to be talking to you today about this topic. I think it's very timely. There's a lot of concern and questions about biotechnology and what GMOs are and where they are in our food, and I know that a lot of dietitians and nutritionists are wondering what to say to consumers about this topic. So I've got a couple of slides here that kind of help explain what this is. First of all, when you look at the USDA's website, how do they define GMO? They refer to two different types of definitions. So one is genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is preferred use of this term by the USDA, but in the public's view, it's mostly referred to as genetic modification. But they both mean the same thing, basically. Genetic engineering refers to using a molecular biology tool to change the genes of a plant or an animal. Genetic modification is similar. The difference might be in some people's mind that most of our food today is genetically modified, and that has been achieved through the practice of crossbreeding or hybrids or selection, where you've modified plants or animals to have a trait that would be more desirable. So they really mean the same thing, but it really refers to the fact that we've changed the genes using a molecular tool. So I have a couple more slides here just to fully explain what GMOs are. The most common ways that we have used genetically modified or genetic engineering in crops is to make them herbicide tolerant or pest resistant. And on this slide I have the two examples that are most common, the Roundup Ready or the BT variant. So these are tools that have been used by commercial seed producers to make their crops either able to resist the being sprayed by a herbicide, and the most common one is glyphosate, which is known as Roundup, or to be able to produce a protein that would cause pests to die when they eat the plant. So that would be the BT toxin. And I think it's important to note that the two traits that have been used to create these different crops are specific for plant or insects. They aren't human pathways that are being influenced by these gene variants. They are specific for making them a plant resistant to a herbicide or making a toxin that will be specific for insects and not to influence human health. So that was a key piece of the reasons why these particular kinds of modifications were made to crops. When we talk about where these are in food, so you say, what are GMOs? Where are they in food? Mostly then, they are in the crops that we grow, the row crops, corn, soybeans, and then also canola, which is grown mainly in Canada, and sugar beets. So the main sources of GMO in the food supply come from those types of foods and ingredients. There are some other fruits and vegetables. Papaya has been modified to be resistant to a virus, and there are some squash that are genetically modified that are in the grocery store. But the vast majority of fruits and vegetables are not GMO, which is, I think, also misunderstood by most of the consumers. On the right of the slide, you see, however, that there are a lot of different ways that GMO is being used in the food supply, and there are a lot of fruits and vegetables, as well as one animal, the salmon. The Aqua Advantage salmon has been approved by the FDA, and it grows twice as fast. So it's a way to get a really healthy source of omega-3 fatty acids into the diet of more people, perhaps, by having a faster-growing salmon. So I think there are some things for positive ways to use this technology in our food supply. I think another thing that people are concerned about is where are GMOs in food. And you hear people talk about 70 to 80% of processed foods have GMO in them. And that refers to the fact that most of the processed foods that are on the store shelves are going to contain oils or starches or soy flour or sugar that have come from genetically modified crops. So thinking about foods and in the ingredients that are in their foods, if corn and soybean and canola and sugar are GMO, then the next logical step is that anything that contains those ingredients would also be GMO. However, we have to remember food science and how we process ingredients. Taking corn for an example, when you refine corn, you generate oil, the lipid fraction, you generate starch and sweeteners, which would be the carbohydrate fraction, and those are highly purified. So any trace of DNA or proteins would not be in those products, and they really aren't going to be any different from the non-GMO products. So it's very challenging to call a product that has corn oil in it GMO because you wouldn't really be able to find any traces of the DNA or the protein. And then similarly, the animal feed that would come as a byproduct of that process as well, when animals or humans consume DNA or protein, those products are digested and broken down to their elemental components, and you don't really find the specific trait lingering in the meat, milk, or eggs of those products. So an animal that's been fed GMO grain, the meat or the milk or the eggs that come from that animal are not going to be able to be detected as having a GMO trait.
So a lot of what we hear today in the lay literature talks a bit about safety overall in terms of GMOs. What would you tell us the most current research is relative to safety?
Yeah, I think that's a major concern always. You know, what are these things, where are they, and are they safe? I'm going to start with the FDA's policy. So we have had GMO ingredients and foods in the U.S. food supply since 1996. Prior to that, 1992, when the FDA was first considering this type of technology, they defined this as being not different from any other technique that we've used to create different varieties of foods. So all the breeding, all the selection, they viewed that as being not different from a safety perspective than the new technologies of gene manipulation through genetic engineering. So the policy from the FDA has been, since 1992, that we don't need to treat genetically engineered or genetically modified foods any differently than we do any other kind of food processing technology. And so there hasn't been a requirement for labeling. I do hear a lot of consumers, though, who say, well, where is the safety? How do you know it's safe? And I think we have to think, as scientists again, about where does this, how do we ever know anything's safe? So the genetically modified plants that have, and animals that have been released into commercialization by the FDA, USDA, and EPA, which are the three bodies that oversee the safety of these in the food supply, are based on, or it takes about 10 years for any of those to get through those systems. So there has to be a lot of evidence given to those agencies to show that whatever trait is being inserted is safe. They look for allergens to make sure that a protein that's going to be expressed in that plant or animal isn't going to cause an allergic response in people, and there have never been any allergic responses documented for a GMO crop. They also have to look to make sure that it's going to be broken down and prove that it isn't going to be absorbed or, transferred into the body intact in an active form. They have to look for environmental safety, and they also have to show that the product is the same chemically and nutrient as the non-GMO counterpart. So these studies have been done mainly in animals because that's really how we do test for safety for most of the food ingredients that we have. And I've shown here on this slide some references where the literature has been reviewed to just really look at a lot of the evidence and say, are these safe? What's the evidence? And for the most part, all of the studies that have been done will show that even though there have been some things that have been shown to be different in animals fed GMO, overall abundance of evidence is that there's very little risk to human health for consuming genetically modified foods or food ingredients. And just to finally add another piece to that, the FDA, the 5 pieces of evidence that I like to point out. First of all, the FDA considers the technology to be similar to conventional breeding. The studies in animals that have been done from researchers at the University of California at Davis, looking at animals before they were fed GMO ingredients and then after they were fed GMO feed, and they found no difference in any of the reproduction or any of the feed efficiencies or any of the growth or anything in the animal's health. So that's a really robust piece of data to look at 100 billion animals and to show that there's really no evidence of any effects on their growth or their development. Number 3 is that there's never been any human disease linked to GMO food or food ingredient. And then a whole host of organizations have approved GMO as being safe. And then just lastly, the National Academy of Sciences has put out a report that reviewed a wide body of literature and came to the conclusion that there wasn't any concern.
Thank you. Nice evidence there in terms of safety. We also think about certain at-risk populations. So I'm thinking of children, pregnant women, the elderly. Is there any reason that we should have concerns about negative effects in those populations?
Yeah, I think that's always a concern, is we want to make sure that our most vulnerable populations aren't going to be at risk. And I do want to point back to this genetically engineered crops report that came out of the National Academies of Sciences. And if you can download this from the web, and if you read the chapter about safety, human health safety, they do a very nice job of looking at the evidence for any kind of risk. And one of the things that they do is they compare disease incidence in different populations and across different countries. So looking at the United States, where we have had GMO foods in our food supply, versus Europe, where they haven't had GMO as much, and looking at disease trends and seeing that those trends are very similar across populations, all kinds of different diseases that people sometimes associate with. You know, there's a higher incidence of, for example, gluten sensitivity, or a higher incidence of autism, or a higher incidence of obesity or diabetes. The trends for those diseases have been following similarly in our countries, suggesting that there's not really something special about our diets or, genetically modified traits that would make that look like there's something more concerning in our populations.
We think about GMOs in a variety of ways, but if we look into the future at, for example, what we may see on our grocery shelves, do you think that anything will change in terms of labeling, and what might those changes be if they were to happen?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dynamic happening right now in the grocery stores. The labeling policy that was passed in last July was sort of a compromise that came about because a lot of states were putting forth proposals to mandate labeling. I mentioned that the FDA's policy has been voluntary labeling, and they approved voluntary labeling back in 1992, but the movement was to require that mandatory labeling of GMO ingredients in foods be implemented. And as a compromise of that, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard that was passed last summer does now require that food manufacturers provide some information on their package about whether or not there is genetically modified ingredients in their food. And those can be done by a label, a USDA symbol, or having access to a website or a toll-free number or a QR code link. Right now, we are in the rulemaking phase of that policy. So there isn't a clear path as to how that will be done and what will be required to be labeled and what will not. And so it's sort of up in the air right now. But what we do see is that the food industry is looking, obviously, for ways to meet consumer demands and to make a profit. And so we're starting to see more foods that are labeled as being non-GMO. And I think that it's very important for dietitians in particular to be wary of this information because it can be somewhat misleading. If you are looking at a product that probably wasn't GMO to begin with, and now it's, has a special package that has non-GMO on it, and it's going to cost more to buy that non-GMO package, even though it's not any way different than the unlabeled package. I think it's important for dietitians to understand that and to recognize that the non-GMO label doesn't make it any safer or more nutritious, and for consumers to be wary of automatically, by default, just assuming that they want to buy the non-GMO product because they are worried that there's something bad about the GMO. No evidence from any of the work that's been done to show that a GMO food or ingredient would have any greater risk to the consumer. So it's going to be a little bit of the wild, wild west for a while consumers figure out what these are, what the labeling means, and food manufacturers figure out, how they're going to work with these new labeling laws.
Dr. MacDonald, thank you so much for providing us with some very current information on GMOs, and I am sure that this kind of information will be very helpful to practitioners out there who are giving information to their patients, their clients, and I so appreciate your updating us on this very important area, GMOs. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.